You're not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of the Modal Node System, MNS Presentation 1125 Excel Major Scale Formula. One of only 4 presentations thus far, but we plan on adding plenty more shortly. Also noting, in this presentation, we can spend all of our time just analyzing the tables from a theory perspective. However, we have another presentation by the same number and name as shown here, where we actually build these tables within Excel, practicing our Excel skills and visualizing tables. 2 skills I think are highly important to anybody that wants to spend a significant amount of time with music. So what we're going to do now is look at the major scale formula. We'll be breaking that major scale formula out into the 12, or building it off of the 12 notes in the musical alphabet. So the best way to do that then is to start with the bottom line of the musical alphabet. Now remember that a lot of times if you learned on the piano, you're still going to see this as being a little bit backwards, because most likely you learned the 7 notes, the scale of the key of C in particular, before you learned the 12 notes, because that's a little bit easier to play. You can play something in key. And that's kind of, once again, how we learn things historically, how things were put together. But it makes more sense from an analytical perspective to say, hey, look, what we have now is we have an octave, and we want even units within the octave. So now we've broken out the octave systematically into an equal 12-unit span instead of just the 7 units. Remember, the 7 units were created before they had the 12 units. That's why it happened. But now we have the 12 units. Therefore, when we think about building the major scale formula, it makes sense to first think about the baseline. If you're doing a computer program, or similarly, same thing, mapping this out in your mind, what are you going to have as your baseline, your building blocks, your bricks? You're not going to have the 7 notes. You're going to have the 12 notes, right? 12 notes. That's the baseline. So we've numbered them here. So we have 1 through 12 so that we can use some simple math, highly useful, not arguing that we should remove the letters entirely. I'm saying that you should know both, because that allows you to do simple math, which becomes really important, as we will see when we get to intervals. I'm also going to abbreviate the sharps and flats, not saying sharp or flat. I'm just going to call it an AB. And people could get mad at me for spelling things improperly with like an AB instead of the proper sharp or flat. Okay, that's fine. But I want to, when we get into spelling, which isn't my strong point even in English, right? Then we can talk more about, the intricacies of spelling. For right now, I want to make it as easy to see the actual pitch that we're talking about. Easiest to see is by number. And then when we have the letter, I'm going to put the AB for the sharp or flat. Okay, and then I'm going to combine them together over here. I'm going to show that one shortly. All right, so then what we want to do is look at the formula. Now, we talked about how to derive the formula. Let me, in a prior presentation, but let me give a quick recap on that. Remember that what happened is you've got like Pythagoras before they had the 12 notes, and they derived the formula, just so you have some context, so it's not arbitrary. I feel like the fact that it seems arbitrary makes this argument of it's all relative. This is just a Western music thing, and it's all relative, but it's not really. It's kind of based on math. So there is a mix between how relative it is culturally and how much it is based on math. So notice what he did is he stuck fifths on each other. So if we start on the C, and he did it with ratios, but let's just think about it as though we have the 12 notes and count out fifths. We'll talk about what a fifth means measure-wise in a 12-note system later, but for right now, it's 7 notes apart. 7 half steps apart is a perfect fifth. So if you stack those on top of each other, going from C, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you get to a G. If I go again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, notice that this goes up to another octave. I'm cool with that. I'm going up an octave, but also around in a circle because they repeat. 6, 7, I get to a D. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I get to an A. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I get to an E. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I get to a B. And then if I do it again, I actually get to an F sharp, which is kind of fudging it, right? So it didn't work perfectly because the math is a little wonky. You have to put a plug in there to make it work. So they adjusted everything and whatnot to kind of tweak it so we get the F instead of the F sharp. And those are the ones, so then if you take those notes and squish them in one octave, putting them order of stepping stones upwise, that's where we get our scale, which first was the C major scale, right? So then they put in the 12 equal spacing. And if you put in the 12 equal spacing, then we note, how do we get those 7 notes with a 12 equal spacing? Well, you use the formula called whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. That's going to be our formula. So now that I have all these notes, what am I going to do now? I'm not going to rederive the thing. I'm going to say now I have all 12 notes, and I'm just going to note that this formula gives us the 7 notes, not only in the key of C, but off of any note that we start on, any of the 12 notes that we decided to break the octave into, any of those 12 notes that I start on. If I apply the formula, we'll get 7 notes that we can call a collection of notes, which most people call like a scale, right? But the scale really, I think, is supposed to be in ascending order. I think most people define a scale as the tonic, right? So you're playing something, even if it's not in ascending order, you're talking that's the tonic of it, the center point, then you call that a scale. But I think technically you're supposed to be playing in ascending order. That's going to be a scale. Otherwise, it's a collection of notes, whatever. So we're going to go, that's kind of important because it does help to be more specific. I just feel like a lot of people aren't as specific with that terminology, so it's hard to be specific with it. Anyway, so if I do that, notice if I skip one, realize that the distance between 2 notes, the simplest distance or our base distance, is a half step. So we broke the octave into 12 steps. They're all equal half steps. So now we've got 12 notes that we have a half step up. I named the first note 1. Programmers would have liked to named it 0, right, if it was on A. But I think it's easier to remember that the A is the 1, right? So that's why I put a 1 there. And then it's going to be half steps. Now, quick note on the naming convention. We're only going to be working with whole steps and half steps right now. Notice that the whole step and half step terminology does not have a relative position in the scale implied in the name. But when we go something past a whole step, then it does. So in other words, if I go from the C to the C sharp, that's a half step. I could also call it, relative to a scale degree, I can call it a 1 note away. I would call it a 1 note away. People don't usually say 1 note away. I say it to be more specific, 1 note away minor second. The second represents the relative position on a scale degree. That's where we're going to run into problems. We'll get into that later. Notice that when I talk about wholes and half steps, I don't have to do that because I can just say it's a half step, and that doesn't have a relative position to a scale degree. If I go 2 notes, we call that a whole step. So you skip a note, you get a whole step. Most of the steps in our formula are whole steps, which makes intuitive sense because a whole step gives you a nice stepping motion upwards. So you get a stair step kind of sound, but it's not too close, so it's too muddied. So it's not too far away, it's not too close, so it makes sense that we break the octave into 12, and then most of the steps we take are whole steps, which makes it not too muddy. It's pretty good distance between, the intervals. So if I go a whole step here, we call that a whole step, then notice that doesn't also have a name that's going to be confused with a scale degree, but we could also call it, we generally call it, when we use the scale degree term, a two note away major second. So, right, and if I say it's a major second, that major second means it's second to a scale degree. That's going to cause us problems when we're trying to measure from a modal center. So just keep that in mind. We'll get there later. And then if I go 3 up, we're not going to deal with that right now, but just realize when you go 3 up, there's no term to go up 3 except that you went up 3 half steps. Otherwise, you have to say it's a minor third. If I go up 4, I got to say it's a minor fourth. I got to say it's a major third. The third doesn't stand for the number of half steps. It stands for the relative scale degree. So we'll get into that later. I just want to introduce this measurement idea because it's really a little wonky. It causes a lot of kind of issues with trying to see what exactly do you mean by that. So we'll get into that later. Right now, we're just dealing with wholes and half steps, and there is our formula. So whole step, half step, whole step, and then if I keep going, you get a whole step, whole step, whole step. It's going up through the octave and then half step back home. If I get to this A, you can think of it as a circle going around to this A and then back home this way as well. So remember, you can think of it as a line, linear, or you can think of it as a circle. Now, if I actually define this how a computer would see it, which I think is useful because simple math is useful, we would say, what is a whole step? It's 2 base note steps. It's 2 half steps. Our base measurement is 1 half step. A whole step represents 2 half steps. So the formula should be 2 in distance, 2. So remember, this is going to be wonky when we go forward, because notice when I measure something, I measure from that point and say it's 2 steps up, 1, 2. I don't want to say I'm going to make this the 1 and that's the third of the 1. That's what we're going to end up doing later. That's going to get messy. From a programming perspective, that's where you get this off by 1 kind of problem. That's where it's like, why are you measuring the head? Like if I have the basketball hoop and it's 10 feet high, and then I have a kid that's 3 feet tall, and I'm trying to find the distance from the kid to the top of the basketball hoop, I don't count the kid's head, like right here, that would be his head, as 1 foot, and then say it's 8 feet distance to the top of the. No, you don't count that. You count the one after it. That's going to become a kind of an issue with our naming conventions later. The wholes and half steps, of course, do that. There's the point that we're on. We're going 2 steps off of that point from the top of the head. I'm not including his head in the calculation. And then you get a half step, which is just 1 distance from the point, and then 2. A whole step is 2, whole step is 2, whole step is 2, and then half step to go back home. Now I've repeated that formula 2 times, so we can see this formula once again going around in a circle or infinitely going up and back if we want to see it from a linear perspective like a timeline. All right, so then if I name these, so here's where we start to get into it. So remember, as we do this, what's going to happen here is we're going to pull 7 notes. We're pulling 7 notes out of our baseline of 12. So the bottom of the pyramid, if you want to think about it as a pyramid, is our 12 notes. We're going to pull from it 7 notes. However, I can start not just on C, but on any of the notes. So that means for the collections of notes, how many could we have that we typically work with in Western music? You're going to have 12, right? Because I could do the same formula on any of these notes. So therefore, there's 12 collection of notes. In the following presentation, we're going to talk about the idea that you could then make each of those points the tonic, which we call modes, and there's going to be 7 different places that we could basically call a tonic. So that means scale-wise, notice how overwhelming this gets. People are going to talk about how many scales are there. Well, there's 12 times 7. That's going to end up to be a lot. But remember, that's too messy to think about, especially when you think in terms of a guitar